Hello Year 4s and welcome back. In the previous term, we were looking at different pieces of non-fiction writing, and you should have ended off by writing your own explanation text. This term, we are going to be looking at folk tales and legends. So our key text for this term is this. It is Hans Christian Andersen's complete book of fairy tales, and I will be sharing a few of these with you as the weeks go by. So what I would like you to do now is to pause the video and give it a think. What is a folk tale? What goes into a folk tale? Do we know any folk tales or remember any that you have heard before?
What is a folk tale? Folk tales are stories passed down from generation to generation, like fables with talking animals, fairy tales with magic, tall tales with huge exaggerations. Even scary stories are considered folk tales. Oh, and legends about historical figures, sometimes involving magical dragon tales, myths about people with supernatural power, and superhero stories are folk tales too. Don't forget about those Hobbit adventure tales. I think I'm getting it. But what about folklore? Oh, folklore. That's the beliefs and customs of a group of people. So folk tales are just one type of folklore. Does that make sense? Yes, complete sense. Now, if only I could get rid of this pesky mosquito.
It is important to remember that most folk tales are very old. They are stories that have been passed down from generation to generation by storytellers. Later, these have been written down, and these have then become the stories that we read in books today. Each tale usually has different versions depending on how it's been retold. You find that folk tales are told all over the world. Often they teach you a lesson of some kind, and fables and fairy tales are a type of folk tale. So folk tale obviously referring to traditional tales, but obviously fables, the ones with morals and you learn something, there's a lesson at the end, and then your everyday fairy tales that we've learned. These are all folk tales. They have no specific author usually because they are stories that have usually been handed down from generation to generation, as I mentioned before, and usually something extraordinary happens to the characters. Remember that some of the characteristics that are found in folk tales are as follows. They are usually simple and straightforward. They can include magic or supernatural powers. The characters often represent human qualities like or such as good, evil, wisdom, foolishness, and laziness. Problems and conflicts in the stories are very clear. The endings are usually happy or satisfying. And then usually you can see good being rewarded and evil being punished. You may be asking, well, what's the difference between a folk tale, a legend, a tall tale, a fairy tale, a fable, a myth? It's a lots of stories that are very, very confusing because there's so many names for them. So what we need to remember is that these are all traditional tales. A fable is usually a short story with a moral or a lesson in it, and it is most of the time it is made up of talking animals. So if we use the example of the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race, and that's a fable because we know that animals can't talk, but in this story they do, and we learn that if you just keep going and you keep trying your hardest, you will eventually reach the end and you'll reach your goal. So there's obviously a moral at the end of that story. A fairy tale, like Cinderella, involves magic. It involves good and evil. You have the evil stepmother. It's usually an imaginary tale, but not always with a happy ending. Sometimes fairy tales don't have a happy ending. A legend is real events or everyday people that often contains exaggeration, realities blended with fiction. So if you've ever heard the story, the legend of Hercules, obviously he was half man and half god, and he was this amazingly strong man, and that's obviously a legend. A tall tale is real people linked to a historic time period that have superhuman abilities, and there's usually humorous problem solving with exaggerated details in them. And a myth, and we have looked at these before, includes gods and goddesses, explains how something came to be in nature or why people do things, with the idea that we are ruled by the gods and goddesses and they've had an impact on our lives. So we are obviously looking at folk tales, and folk tales are stories that have been part of oral tradition, which means they've been retold over and over again. So they're an oral tradition of a certain group of people from long time ago. And that's how you find that we can fit in fables and fairy tales, because these have been told over and over and over again to different cultures, to different people, and you have slightly different stories. So if we look at the story of Cinderella, if you look at different cultures, there is a similar story in different cultures, but maybe with different characters in them. But that has been passed down, traditionally passed down from generation to generation. So remember, a folk tale is a story that has been part of oral tradition of a certain group of people, and it has been passed down from generation to generation. My task to you today is the following. As we've already discussed, a folk tale is a story that has been passed down from generation to generation. I would like you to go and ask your adults if they have any stories that have been passed down to them from their parents or their grandparents. Are there any stories that they were told as children that they remember being told and that they've maybe told you? I would also like you to go online and research some folk tales. You can also, like I said, have a look at a fairy tale or fables. We are going to be looking at Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, and you may have heard some of the stories that he has written. So I'm going to read a few of them to you over a course of the next few weeks, but I'd also like you to go and research some of them. So these are stories like The Princess and the Pea, Thumbelina, The Little Mermaid, The Emperor's New Clothes, which is the one I will be reading to you in the next lesson. We've also got The Travelling Companion, The Daisy, The Tinderbox. All of these are some of his fairy tales that he's written. So go and research them, go and have a read of them, and go and research some folk tales, ones that you have heard or your parents have heard. And can you find if there is a similar story somewhere else in the world? Please remember to share all of this with us on Tapestry and make sure that we can see all the hard work that you are doing.